Thank you, President Reisling, members of the board. It's always my pleasure to present the district's 5-year forecast. I get to do this twice a year, in October and then again in May. And if there's any significant changes throughout the year, I go ahead and update it then too. It's been a long time since I've had to do a mid-year adjustment, but really our forecast has been consistently on target. We like to keep our revenues within about 2% of projections and our expenditures within 2% of projections, and that's been the case. That's why I've only done an update in May over the past few fiscal years. This forecast will run through fiscal year 2020, so this goes out there to, seems like a long ways out there, but just to get into some of the details. The forecast is required by the state of Ohio, as I said, to be done twice a year. And what it does is it helps the district plan for their finances into the future. If there are deficit balances in your forecast, you can't approve contracts on those. You can't approve those contracts if you don't have the funds available. And what that does is it keeps us in check to make sure we're not spending money that we don't have. Overall revenue increases on the forecast you'll see are roughly 0.5% to 1% over the fiscal year 16 and 17, and then they remain flat throughout. The first thing I wanted to talk about in a little bit more detail is real estate taxes. Our first slide here, you can see what I have up here right now is real property assessed values. You can see right here in tax year 2010, it was much higher and a big drop in 2011. What happened then was reappraisal in Franklin County. You remember the financial crash in 2008. At that time, housing values were pretty high. These values right here are in Class 1 and Class 2 real estate, which is residential and agricultural, and also commercial and industrial. So you see a really large drop from tax year 2010 to 2011. That was roughly a $216.4 million loss in tax value, not in taxes, but in tax value. But it did cause the school district to have their tax revenue decrease at that time too, but not to that same extent. Then you'll see a bump in from tax year 2012 to 2013. What happened right then was the casino came online. The casino was $165 million worth of assessed value. That was the full value of the casino. The assessed value is about $35 million. So we had partial tax collections in fiscal year 14 and full tax collections in fiscal year 15, which was last fiscal year. You can see another slight drop from tax year 2013 to 14. That was we had a triennial update. We do reappraisal every 6 years and update in the middle of those reappraisals. So we again had a small decrease. I attribute that decrease to, and this is again Class 1 and Class 2 properties, mostly from our home values in our school district. We had a slight decrease in our home values. People are filing complaints or Board of Revision tax complaints to the county auditor. Those take a little while to move through, and the foreclosures that happen within the school district, and this is not just in our school district, but this is statewide, caused our values to go down a little bit. What I can say about that, though, is our Class 2, which is commercial and industrial, was actually up about $13 million, whereas our Class 1, residential agricultural, went down about $32 million. So those two things offset each other a little bit. And the next slide, this is our public utility personal property. We've had a lot of talk over the years about our tangible personal property going away. We don't collect that anymore. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit as far as what our tangible personal property tax replacement has done. But this is what these are is public utility personal property. It's the power lines, it's the gas lines, it's all the things that our utility companies use to transmit electricity and gas within our school district. You can see these values have had a nice steady increase over the last 5 tax years. The good thing about public utility personal property tax is it's taxed at the full value, whereas Class 1 and Class 2 real estate As the value goes up, the millage rate will go down, so you're collecting about the same amount, and vice versa. If the tax rate goes down, if the assessed value goes down, the millage rate will go up, so you collect about the same. In this particular type of property, the tax rate is the full tax rate. Our tax rate right now is 61.2 mils, and that's our Class 1 effective rate. Our Class 1 voted rate, 61.2 mils. Our effective rate is 34.79, so that 25 mil difference or so is what we can collect on this. As it goes up, if the value goes up, it goes up. You can see that on your forecast. If you look at the main forecast page on line number 1.020, you can see from tax year or fiscal year 14, it was 5.8 million. It jumped up to 6.6 million, and I'm projecting it to grow a little bit throughout the forecast. So you can really see how this particular source of taxes has helped us out. I always like to talk about where we stand in the county. I think sometimes there's some misinformation out there about what people think about our taxes in Southwestern City Schools. I'll be going back to this slide in a minute, but I just wanted to talk to you for current tax year 2014, collection year 2015. If you look in this first column, this is all of our voted tax rate that goes to Class 1 real estate. So in Southwestern City Schools, we are currently 11th out of 16 school districts in the county is what our tax rate is. This would include our PI levy, any debt that we have that we're paying on the new schools that we're building, and our operating millage. So this is all of our millage wrapped up into one on our Class 1 tax rate. You can see that that millage rate is 11th out of 16, and on our effective operating rate, we're actually down to 13th out of 16. We're roughly 13 mils lower than Westerville City. If we took that 13 mil amount and multiplied it by our assessed valuation in our Class 1, Class 2 real estate, that would equate to about $30 million more in property taxes. So that's a pretty significant difference as far as what we tax our taxpayers in Southwestern City Schools. The next large amount of dollars that we get are from the state of Ohio. As you know, House Bill 64 was put into place July 1 of 2015. There was a lot of changes in this House bill as far as how they calculated revenue for school districts in the state of Ohio. We were given projections by the Legislative Service Committee. Those projections, I'm always cautious if those are right or not. What we did find out, we had our first payment on the new funding formula this past Friday on the 9th, and I got on there as quick as I could, went through the calculations, did my own calculations, kind of vetted everything out, and I feel comfortable that the amounts that we received from the Legislative Service Commission were wrong. So that does happen over time. They were actually lower than what these numbers will be. What I can tell you also, as I got on there and kind of cross-checked everything, I had to call the state because there was a few things on their formula that wasn't quite right either. So I got to talk to ODE, and they're going to recalculate and send out some new information based on some things that I found that weren't quite correct. Not materially incorrect, but they weren't correct. So what you can see here is in fiscal year 15 to fiscal year 16, we're going to see an overall increase of about $2.1 million. Now, you can see in our unrestricted aid, it's about $6.8 million. And then we have a decrease in restricted at about $1.8 million. The reason why there's a decrease in state unrestricted is that we had a large Medicaid back payment that was over several years period of time at about $1.6 million. So that we're not expecting to receive that next year. So it's really not a decrease in restricted aid. It's just that we had a one-time payment last year that shows that decrease. Also, what happens as you move through a fiscal year, they go back and they recalculate as they get new information from prior prior years, and they make adjustments in your current fiscal year based on prior year funding. So we had some other increases in there from last year that were from 2 fiscal years ago that changed our funding amounts. So that can get a little bit confusing on how that works. But what I do want to point out, probably the most important thing is this property tax allocation. Within that, I spoke earlier about a tangible personal property tax replacement that we had been getting over time. In the last forecast I did, I had it being totally eliminated this current fiscal year and not receiving it in any of the years in the future. But we are going to get a small amount next year. We're going to get about $1.8 million of property tax, tangible personal property tax replacement that I didn't anticipate. But the decrease is we had $4.5 million before, and we're only going to get $1.8 million. So there is a decrease. That's why you see this decrease from 11.8 or 14.8 to 11.8. That's why there's about a $3 million decrease, because we are losing some of that. This will totally eliminate our tangible personal property tax reimbursement. We won't have to worry about it in the future if that's going to be there or not. It's not going to be there based on the state's calculations, so that you can see when we go out to fiscal year 17, that's being eliminated. When I did the calculations, it appears that we are in what's called a capped district. That means that our enrollment numbers plugged into the new formula show that we are we're at the maximum amount we can receive, which is 7.5%. And that cap goes into effect for the fiscal year 17 also, which will be 7.5%. But I'm not showing that we're going to get the total 7.5% in fiscal year 17. I just want to be cautious with that. There's something out there called the state share index that's a big part of our calculation, and that number changes every single payment based on things that are going on in other school districts. It could have to do with their valuation, it could have to do with their student counts. There's a bunch of factors that go into that number that you really honestly can't trace. So our current state share index is about 61%, meaning that the state will fund if the amount is $10,000. I'm just making a number up so it's easy. If the amount is $10,000, the state will give us $6,100 if our state share index is 61%. That number fluctuates because we have such a large number of a large amount of state aid. If it goes by 1% or 2%, it can make significant difference in our amount we receive. So I'm keeping it around 3% increase as far as what we're going to get in the unrestricted state aid and our restricted state aid. I do think that we'll at least get that, but we could probably get more. But that's just being conservative and not counting our eggs before they're hatched, I guess. Okay, back to overall revenues are going to stay pretty flat. Not a lot of increases there based on those factors I just talked about. We are getting more state dollars, but they are taking some away. Switching to expenditures, obviously our biggest expenditures are salaries and benefits. But I want to go back to the slide that I talked about a minute ago. If you look in this third column, that's our per-pupil expenditure. Now, this is based on fiscal year 13 and 14 because that's the only information I could get from the Ohio Department of Education. But what this shows us is that our level is $10,388 per student, what we spent in fiscal year 14. The state average last year was $10,913, so we're spending less than the state average per pupil. In the county, we're spending 12th out of 16. We're in that same kind of quadrant, that bottom third of the state or of the county. And if you do some calculations based on our student enrollment, if you take 21,000 students and take about a $4,500 per student difference between the top district in the county and us, that would equate to roughly $95.4 million that we would be spending above and beyond what we're spending right now. If you just look at the state average, if you plug that number in there and took the difference, it's $11 million more that we would spend. And that's some significant amounts. So I show this just to show our community that we are on top of things as far as our expenditures go. We spend less than the state average. We're in the bottom third in the county. So we're trying to give our taxpayers the best bang for their buck, and I think that this shows that. So that's always a good slide to show. Before I go into the overall expenditures, revenues, and cash balances, I want to talk a little bit more about our personnel services. We currently have all of our employee groups. The contracts are expiring at the end of this fiscal year. There was 2% increases in those salaries. I also assumed 2% increases in the future. That doesn't mean that that's what that's going to be. That's just the number that I put in the forecast to make sure that we're at least projecting something out there that we can base our numbers against. One very positive thing in this forecast that we did, we added all-day, everyday kindergarten in this fiscal year. That's gone off without a hitch. Everything has been, we got them all hired up, and we got our people in place, and we got our new buildings open, so we had the staff and the space and everything ready to go to put those in there. So all of our numbers in this fiscal year and the fiscal years in the future include the all-day, everyday kindergarten, and I think that's going to reap benefits for years to come. Another big part of our budget is employee retirement and insurance benefits. Most of our benefits that come are based directly in proportion to our salaries. So as salaries go up, our contribution for the retirement system or workers' comp or any of those other things go up proportionately. One thing I do want to point out, throughout the past forecasts, I had included a 10% increase in health insurance costs based on trends and based on the Affordable Care Act and what's going on with that. We just had an insurance committee meeting last week that we accepted a funding rate of 10.9%. So it was a little bit higher than the 10%, but it is in that general ballpark. We're working on some cost containment measures and talking with our employee groups as we have in the past to look at plan design changes and possibly some things to do with trying to get that down a little bit. So that's I would say one negative thing that trying to get that health care cost down is going to be something that we're going to have to work on. The Affordable Care Act, as I had spoken in previous forecasts, we are now required to offer insurance for any employee that's working at least 30 hours a week. We had several substitutes and other employees that didn't qualify for insurance before sign up for that in calendar year 2015. Right now we're working on the reporting of all that. That's a pretty monumental task, just to say the least. But we're working on that, and we'll have all the forms that are required by us to provide ready to go when the calendar year 2016 kicks in. We are tracking a Cadillac tax. There's been a lot of rhetoric in the news about the Cadillac tax and if they're going to keep it in or keep it out, but it is in our forecast. The Cadillac tax is in our forecast, making sure that we're accounting for that so it's not going to blindside us, and we have that in there to make sure that we're accounting for it, and if it doesn't happen, that would be a positive. If it does happen, we're planning for it. So that's where we stand with that. Purchase services, really our biggest costs in purchase services are we still have a large amount going out to community schools. Last year was about $16 million, so that's still a very large number. Of the total purchase services of $38 million, that accounts for a big chunk of that. So really, watching how we're educating our students and making sure we're doing the right things to try to pull those students back. I think a big thing with that will be our all-day, everyday kindergarten. We're up about 170 more kids than we were last year in kindergarten. So I think we're getting some of those students back that maybe went to a charter school that offered all-day, everyday kindergarten. So that's one thing that we can do to try to help out with that. Other purchase services, I've spoken about this before. Utilities are in there as well. That's our other big purchase service cost is utilities. The new buildings, they're more efficient than our older buildings, so we do see some savings as far as our efficiency would go in our gas usage or our electric usage. However, the older buildings didn't have air conditioning, so those two things kind of offset each other. So really what we thought would happen is pretty much happened with those. We do have air conditioning, which is a wonderful thing. It's it's very good when it's hot in the classroom to keep everything nice and cool, so kids aren't worried about or thinking about how hot they are. They're focused on their schoolwork. So we've really kind of offset that cost, that increased cost of air conditioning, with the savings that we've had in these more energy efficient buildings. Last but not least, just to talk about our materials and supplies, one of our biggest costs in there is our bus fuel. I've spoken before that a 10-cent increase is about or a 30-cent increase is about $100,000 a year in increased fuel costs. So fuel costs have been down a little bit, so we did have see a decrease in our fuel costs from previous years. That's good. I'm keeping it at about $1.3 million of expenditure for our fuel this year, and I'm showing that a little slightly up from last year, but we'll see how that goes as far as gas prices. But we'll keep watch on that. So to wrap up the whole forecast, I just want to first we'll show you the blue is our revenues. You can see our revenues decline slightly from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 17, and then they really flatten out. The decline is mostly accounted for in the loss of the tangible personal property replacement and some other one-time hits that we had in previous fiscal years. So that's where that's showing. Our expenditures in red growing a little bit faster than our revenues, so that's something that we have. That's a challenge that we have. Once again, I've said before, we're probably conservative, about 2% on both sides of this, so it's going to end up a little bit better than that. But just if everything happened as I projected, we would be spending more than we're taking in, and starting in fiscal year 2018. So our cash balances is the good part of our story. I was on what's called a surveillance credit call from Standard & Poor's, and we talked a lot about cash balances. And I've said many times at the board table that we try to keep our cash balances somewhere between 3 and 6 months of our operating expenditures, and we've done that over time for a pretty consistent amount of time. So these cash balances, although they seem large, they are right in our range of 3 to 6 months of cash, 3 to 6 months of operating expenses. So the credit rating agencies like to see that. They like to know that you are planning with good, prudent cash balances. They also want to know, they ask questions like, so what are you going to do in these future years as far as getting your spending in line with your revenues to make sure you're not eating into that cash balance. And just I always talk about our prudent budgeting, where we try to be a little bit conservative on our revenues and expenditures, and that's another thing that I like to hear. So everything is right on track. I feel comfortable with the forecast as far as where we're heading as a district, and real confident that these numbers are only going to get a little bit better.
The Cadillac Tax. Mm-hmm. Could you just mention what that is?
The Cadillac Tax is the federal government has set a certain amount that they say premiums should be. Let's just say $20,000 for an employee. If your health insurance premiums are above that 20%, you pay on the difference. You pay a penalty for that difference. So that's where the Cadillac Tax comes from. The only way to get your premium amounts down is usually by plan design change. So that's where those two things go hand in hand. The trouble with the Cadillac Tax is it's not a shared expense. It's not an expense that we can put back onto in our premium amount and co-fund with our employees and us. So it's a direct payment that the school district would have to make for that. That's the hardest part of that Cadillac Tax, in my opinion.